it's time for us to dive into our next segment, which is the interview segment. In this segment, of course, we usually have experts with specified topics where they help us to dissect and make complex matters simpler for our understanding. Of course, as you all know, climate change is a reality, and the realities are closing in on us every now and then. As a result, of course, nations usually gather every year in what is called Conference of Parties, COP. This is under the United Nations. And of course, the last one was held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt on November 2022. And a lot of agreements were reached. Part of that agreement, some of the things that came up in that, conference was the issue of loss and damage fund. Of course, we will be talking a lot about this, and we have in the studio someone to help us understand what this means and bringing also into it the gendered perspective. All of these are complex as far as I am concerned, but we have in the studio this morning to help us break this down. He is Mr. Ogunlade Olamide Martins. Good morning.
Good morning.
Mr. Martins is the Program Manager, Corporate Accountability and Public Participation Africa, otherwise known as CAPA. Good morning, Mr. Martins, once again.
Good morning.
When we say loss and damage in relation to climate change or climate justice, as a lot of people prefer to also add these days, what does that mean, loss and damage? What do we mean by loss and damage? Who is losing and who is being damaged?
Thank you very much. And that's a very interesting question. And then unfortunately it has come to stay. But then it's very good for us to lay this foundation. The climate is changing, and that's a fact. And from existing literature, Africa contributes about 3 to 4% of the global emission. And Africa bears the biggest brunt. And that's why you have flooding in some part of Nigeria, and of course desert encroachment in some other parts. And that's why you have increase in food prices, and you have evasion from those who are natural nomadic herders coming down south with force to take over lands. So because of these infractions that have been accumulated over the years, there is need for somebody responsible for these catastrophes and devastations, so to speak, to be responsible. Okay. And that's where the concept of loss and damage comes in. But then, not just in the last COP, it has become a lingering conversation. And what we have seen clearly over the years is a deliberate attempt by the big polluters. And when I say big polluters, I mean China, Russia, and maybe United States, dodging liabilities. You know, climate change, as some have argued, is natural to an extent, but human-triggered to a large extent. You know, people continue to dig the earth in search of oil without having sustainability behind their mind. Okay. And then when they go on with these acts arbitrarily, they open up the earth without taking care of the earth. And in damaging this, Africa with less technical facilities or capacity continues to bear the brunt. Okay. And that's why conversation have, effectively triggered to us, for you to be responsible for this infraction, some element of justice is required in form of you paying commiserately compensations that will address these infractions. So that's where we have.
So that's where we have loss and damage. Yes. So it's a fund that is that is created for the big polluters, as you prefer to call them, to contribute to, so that this fund can be shared by those who are bearing the brunt in Africa. Is that what that means?
It's supposed to be a fund, but as it is now, there is a deliberate attempt to silence the effective operationalization of this fund. Okay. So let me just lay this background. We have adaptation fund. Yeah. And what that means is take this fund and begin to increase your coping capacity to the catastrophes of climate change. But it's not working. I mean, how long will I continue to cope? It will get to a limit that I will exhaust my coping capacity. True. And then we have mitigation funds that is not even sufficient. And this allows further infractions by the global north. Big corporations, big countries, US, China, and Russia. And then people in Africa and global south are saying, we can't continue to go on like this. Let us address this issue. So as we speak right now, the fund is yet to be fully effective in its operationalization.
But its critics have alluded to what you just mentioned, that We've had adaptation fund. We had mitigation fund. What has been done in that regard? Now, why are we coming to this party conference, as you may want to call it, to come speak about what you refer to as loss and damage? Is there just what is the justification, judging from where we're coming from? What's been the justification for asking for loss and damage funds?
And because of you not been sincere with promises, I mean the Global North, these funds are not coming. And that is why Africa and Global South are saying, because we can't continue to rely on promises on papers that are failed to materialize, give us something more concrete. And it appears that the adaptation funds coming to Africa were a form of loans, not grants. We are talking about climate justice. We are talking about issues that Africa and the Global South is not responsible for. So in the concept of justice, it's not charity. It's somebody being responsible for their deliberate infraction. The North, Europe and America grew on the wings of gas. And Africa is bearing the brunt. So adaptation is a form of charity. Come on, take this money while we continue our infraction and our business as usual. But it has failed. They have failed. Even in 2019, there was supposed to be 100 billion USD that wasn't released. Modalities towards the release of this fund remain to hang. And Africa is yet to have the capacity yet to assess. You know, when we approach these guys, we look beggarly. We are like beggars asking for charity. But no, we haven't. And that's why we are shifting that conversation. Because of the age-long deliberate silence and what I refer to as intentional, omission to promises in form of you guys losing the funds that you promised. So we are shifting that conversation to having critical fund that is meant to address this issue. So loss and damage wouldn't have been necessary if the global green finance in form of adaptation and mitigation have been effectively covered. But we are dealing with a group of people who seems to be wiser in their thought, and they continue to delay responsibility.
Now, you talked about, of course, loss mitigation funds even being paid. Of course, these guys still continue with causing the havoc that necessitated that funds in the first place. Are we saying that if they are to go through with this proposed loss and damage fund, they will then stop whatever is it they are doing that has consistently caused damage to the environment? And
that's where the issue is. COP is supposed to be a conference of parties where countries in Africa, Global South, and of course the entire world speaks up their mind. But the position of Africa is now streamlined to a group of negotiators called the African Group of Negotiators. And because of the insignificance of our contribution to the global economy, our voice continues to win in such conversations that has global relevance. So it will stop them from polluting. And that's where the problem is. In fact, you see them advancing renewable energy options.
Yes.
And then heavily you see their presence on the shores of Nigeria, in South Africa, still carrying out exploration of oil. And then you begin to ask yourself, what are these guys really preaching? And then the question is, you guys developed on the wings of gas. And then you've discovered renewable energy option, and Africa continue to bear the brunt, and you are telling us to now put our oil in the ground. Yes, we'll put those oil in the ground, but for the damages that you have done, somebody must be responsible. Somebody just have to be responsible. And that's where the concept of justice in the climate conversation comes in. The idea is to put the oil in the ground, but as we begin to manage the consequences of your adventure or venture in business, that you've now developed your country to an extent that you've now seen oil as the problem of the world, even though that's even still contentious. And I'll give you an instance. In Glasgow 2021, COP26, China failed to show up.
Yes.
Russia failed to show up. America wasn't too fully present. And then when you ask them, they tell you, no, it's difficult for us to keep oil in the ground. We are going to consider phasing down emission. What does that mean? And then you see them advancing solutions that are alien to our natural or elementary knowledge. You see them advancing net zero. That somebody have to be polluting. And then Africa that has the natural reserve for absorption or carbon sequestration due to our large pool of water bodies, and our forests can continue to sink this carbon.
That's where I wanted you to explain.
And that's where the concept of loss and damage comes in.
Yes, because
it looks like...
a lot of people who whose understanding of the technicalities of climate change is limited keep asking, how does Africa bear the brunt of what happens in faraway Europe and America? So you began already given those factors that you've mentioned, but kindly explain so that we have that understanding of how Africa and the global south have continued to bear the brunt of the activities of the Europe and America.
And America and Russia. I think it's simple science. There's no boundary to the flow of air.
Yeah.
And we are all global citizens existing under one universe, so to speak. So whatever happens in China, whatever happens in America, or whatever happens in form of global emission in Russia, has a way of flowing down to the entire continent and to the entire globe and to the entire world. We have not developed that capacity yet to curb emission or to cut emission at source. And that's why if you release gas in your house, your neighbor is also exposed to the consequences of your action. So, and because the way we extract oil, the way we produce oil, the way we process oil is open. So when this exhaust goes into the air, nobody has yet developed the capacity to curtail the flow of this emission. And when, of course, when it gets to the atmosphere, it warms the atmosphere. And the emission gets into the ozone layer, depletes it, and then that's why you have seasonal changes in Africa. The water are not coming when they should come. The rains are not coming when they should come. And then Africa continues to bear the brunt. And unfortunately, the proceeds from this business, let me use the word business, hasn't trickled. It's just a business, really. And people are smiling to the banks. And then Africa has not even gotten a dime of this. Go to Ogoniland in Rivers State. I mean, just yesterday in Ayetoro, we had the king, tell us how his community is now sinking. Ayetoro is in Ondo State, Nigeria here. Ayetoro has 3 major oil corporations exploring offshore in that community. And then 85% of the land under the water. 75% of the properties, buildings, gone, and still continue to go. I mean, I said Ayetoro responsible for this infraction. There are oil companies, into oil business in that community, whose actions are responsible for the rising sea level in that community, and they are not taking action. So, we are not responsible, and we know. These guys are responsible, and their actions are trickling down. There's a ripple effect to those corporate activities here in Africa, and they are visible.
There was also a similar protest, rather, that is linked to what you said happened in Ayetoro by people from Ogoniland yesterday, although it's been an ongoing agitation for justice for the especially host communities in Israel. But one would have expected that the Petroleum Industry Act should have efficiently taken care of that.
Ideally, yes. Ideally, yes. You have to ask yourself why it took us about 13 years to have a Petroleum Industry Act that has failed effectively to address the issue. But the answer is not far-fetched. You have an act that conveys very strongly the interest of the West. Very clearly. From our history, we have seen how porous our policies are to accommodating the profit mindset of the West at the expense of those in the frontline community. How can you vote 3% of fund from extractive business to addressing host community and then commission about 11-12% for frontier business in the scrubbing oil in the north? It shows the priorities of our government. And
even the 3%, yesterday there was an agitation again by the host communities because there is I don't know if you're aware, there is a review ongoing of the PIA, which has now mandated the host communities to bear certain brunts, which the host communities are now saying that if we are to do all of this again that you are bringing, it will further shrink the 3%
that is not even coming to them yet.
Well, in any case, it's an interesting conversation. So there is a gendered perspective to loss and damage. Kindly explain this. What is the gender? I thought, like you said, air knows no boundary. This impact, they do not differentiate between genders. But what is the gendered perspective to loss and damage conversation?
Okay, when there is when Lake Chad is disappearing, women bears the biggest brunt. You know, naturally, by their biological makeup, women need more water than men, so to speak. In taking care of the homes, in raising their children, now this seems to be the greatest victim. When you have farmers in the south now living in fears because of possible evasion from their colleagues and counterparts in the north, coming down south in search of water for their heads, women seem to lose their rest. So livelihood are being threatened, and we have seen this established over the years. But if you go to Ayetoro, and I may able to challenge media to focus extensively on what is happening there. If you go to Ayetoro, the king told us expressly that he had to partition his palace to accommodate women from his community who have now lost their shelter. So when you talk about climate change, the agenda for loss and damage, women and children and people living with disability seems to be the biggest problem. Local economy is being threatened, health and well-being is being challenged, communal survival is being threatened, and it appears we've exhausted our coping capacity. Men that we are might still want to be adaptive, but then there's a limit to your adaptation ability. But women in their own makeup depend extensively on things that are now eroding them. And then that's why we are saying whatever it is that should come up from this conversation. And I'll go back to why COP28 should effectively address loss and damage. Whatever should come up from our agitation for loss and damage must at least put on a gender lens, so that women are also accommodated in the scheme of things and in the priorities we advance.
But let's go back, because Nigeria is ours, and you mentioned Ayetoro a couple of times, and the crisis ongoing there. One would assume that there is a local government in Ayetoro, and then there is a state government before we talk about federal government, and then before we advance to other maybe international organizations for help and all of that. What's the local and state governments doing to bring respite to this, troubled people?
And I'm struggling not to be emotional right now. Where Ayetoro is in Ilaje local government in Ondo State. And by the time we engage the king of that community, it appears government is, there is complete absence of government. And I have no apology for that. Ilaje local government does not even have the financial capacity to manage the rising sea level. And then when we ask the king, what is the state government doing? A couple of letters have been written.
Because I'm surprised. Sorry, you keep referring to the king. I was expecting you to say local government chairman,
no, because,
or the governor, or the commissioner.
There, because they weren't available. They weren't available. And the community now have to develop, survival tactics, which is now eroding them anyway. So the king said, and the community said, they've approached the state government and they said, hey, this is actually above us. Letters have been written to the federal government for respite, like we did mention. No solution, nothing is coming up. And then the king also mentioned, and this is a little bit disturbing to people like us in the civil society, that contracts running to billions of naira were being awarded for this same contract, for this same project rather, and nothing visible on ground. In fact, there was even one that came with his men and machineries only to disappear the next day. So it appears government is not around, and government has gone to sleep. And just in our event yesterday, we said, how come these guys come every 4 years to campaign and we are not holding them? Maybe you consider a boycott of election. Since they have decided to exclude you from national consideration, you also have to fight back by any means you can as a community. So government is not around. It's a group of people fighting for their survival, and who seems to have exhausted their ability to survive.
Now, the critics of Loss and Damage Fund have often cited examples like this. Remember that we had Ecological Fund that was meant to address some of these issues, and we also have reports of how these funds were filtered into private pockets across states of the Federation. Does this justify those critics who are saying this loss and damage that governments of Africa and Global South are asking is just another way of increasing funds that will be made available for them to loot and then leave the people, the real people who are bearing the brunt, just like you said, like people of Ayetoro, to their fate?
Well, I would say yes and no. No, in the sense that the concept behind loss and damage is quite different. Different because it won't be entirely managed by state actors who have shown some level of irresponsibility to climate injustices within their domain. It will have some element of oversight by the frontline communities. Media will be actively involved, and of course civil society.
But the same thing was said of ecological funds.
But then we don't have control over that. The state government does. And then we can't, it's just like security vote. How can you go to a government and ask him, how did you spend your 250 million per month security vote? It's entirely within the domain and of course the discretion of the state governor. But loss and damage is fashion, and that's why you have traditional committees still trying to fashion out how effective we could operationalize this loss and damage. So it's going to have some element of oversight. You don't just impose project on the community without seeking the consent of the community or accommodating their local expertise, as we have in the ecological fund. Yeah, so this is being carefully drafted to convey not just the interest of the government to supervise provision or project, but then the expertise of the locality that are continuing to suffer, the frontline community, to suggest what project works, and then how this project will be monitored, and give certificate of completion of project jointly identified. So it appears this is like a sharp deviation from the norm and establishment that have continued to fail us as a people.
Okay, but of course, at the start of, or at the proposal level of every project like this, you hear some of these very wonderful ideas. But we know for a fact that if these funds were to go into any country at all, government will be heavily involved, even if it's just at the federal level. Of course, with all of these measures that you've reeled out also apply in that instance, if maybe the funds go to, say, Ministry of Environment, and then the Ministry of Environment will now be responsible for, disbursing these funds. Isn't that the same that happened in the ecological fund? Because these are some of the fears that keep coming up when issue of loss and damages, anytime issue of loss and damage is mentioned, particularly with respect to our very unique country, Nigeria, where funds will be, clearly allocated for a project. I know for my state, for example, Niger State, where a former governor is still being hounded for about 6 billion naira of ecological funds that he can't even account for. And you have communities in riverine areas. Very recently, when the Lagdo Dam in Cameroon was to be opened, Niger State was one of the states put on alert, and we saw how communities where even just 300,000 naira could have helped an entire village but the funds are just not there. So aren't this proposal, these measures that you've said, just very beautiful on paper, but when it comes to the time when the money actually comes in, we see a different thing altogether? Yeah,
so it is our hope, and I believe that COP28 would deliver not just the loss and damage fund, but will also reel out, like I did mention, how we can put on our lens, both as media and as civil society, to see to the effective operationalization of this fund. We know we are dealing with people who could loot. Who could feed on fraud. So we are not totally obnoxious of what they could do. From experience, like you did mention. And I also want to believe that the reason why you have this delayed passage of this loss and damage fund was to accommodate thoughts, including those that you've just mentioned. So we expect that when this fund finally is being operationalized, it will enable us to report progress or otherwise, or project jointly administered, and then give feedback per time to those who should have this feedback. And of course, this feedback should convey entirely progress being made in identified frontline. But let me also say that loss and damage would only be effective when we have the capacity to measure infraction.
Exactly.
So,
that's sorry, just to jump in to add to what you're about to say. I had an interaction with an activist from Kenya, and he's of the opinion that okay, so what happens when these funds come in? Countries like Nigeria will begin to claim the larger chunk, because they will say by virtue of their land mass and all of that, they suffer more. And then where does that leave a country like Kenya, he was asking. So how, are there also measures being, part of the thoughts that you say are going into the process? Are this also being considered with regards to how these funds will be shared in accordance with who lost what and who have suffered what damage?
Yes. Coincidentally, we just returned from Kenya, and Kenya is like a replica of Nigeria. There's a particular county in Kenya where we visited called the Taita Taveta. Taita Taveta is a community that is almost in the past because of the heavy impact of extractivism going on in this community. So they are also right to demand for loss and damage. But then to go straight to your question, I think that's why we continue to call on the African Group of Negotiators and the head of government delegations from African countries to begin to devise means to measure infractions. For crying out loud, you can't manage what you have refused to measure. You can't manage what you haven't measured yet. So, and that's why the West are continuing to play down on our intelligence. You guys are asking for money to address commissionate fund to address historical liabilities and imminent infraction. But where are they? I told you just one example of the many infractions you have in Nigeria. Taveta is just one of the many infractions you have in Kenya. The other day we were in Kambele region in Cameroon. I mean, you also will struggle not to cry when you go to those places. So these places have what it takes to demand for loss and damage. But we begin to prevail on the AGN. Not to just go into COP and look beggarly and ask for charity. Have you developed the in-house capacity as Africa? Have you mandated governments in Africa to take a stock of the damages accruable to the interest and the profit mindset of the West that continue to damage our land, threaten our survival, distort our water bodies, pollute? Do you have the data here to demand for what? So it's a conversation that we are throwing to the government. And that's why you see government interventions continue to fail over the years. You see projects being awarded, budgets being awarded for projects over and over again. There seems not to be an evaluation means yet. And the reason why you have this conversation on loss and damage continue to linger is because, yes, they're willing to pay, quote and unquote, but then what do they pay for? And then how do we ensure that funds meant to address identified frontline projects goes to the frontline without unlimited influence of government who are also waiting like hyena to feed on the proceeds of this fund? I'll give you an instance. The Abacha loot. It got to a point that the World Bank say, hey, we can't give Nigeria money again. Open the social register. We'll supervise how this works. Sorry to digress, but an example.
No, it is very important.
And then we identify this poorest of the poor and we give them money. So the only role given to the state is to identify the poor. The money goes to the beneficiaries themselves. That's an example of what should happen in the management of loss and damage, considering the nature and the tendency of African leaders.
Now we're preparing for COP28, and a lot definitely is being pushed, especially with respect to loss and damage, which you say you are hopeful. A lot of people have criticized COP. Over the years. Every year, people gather from various countries with an identified theme, and everybody gets opportunity to talk. Sometimes they talk tough, sometimes they speak very interesting English, and after the conference, you begin to look for where are the outcomes of some of these conversations. So going forward, really, let me even ask you, because from what you've said, you've been involved in this for quite a while. Has COP been a useful conference to anybody at all?
Oh my goodness. It at first feel like a political gathering where you have, international power players gather. While we are in COP to protest and agitate for rights of the front line, you see some men in briefcase and suits and in checkbooks also making deals that will advance their interests. While some of us return from COP disgruntled, embarrassed and disappointed sustainably over the years, you see some, smiling to the banks almost immediately. So to answer your question, COP has been reduced to a marketplace.
Thank you.
It has been reduced to a marketplace. And I'll give you an instance. In Glasgow 2021, you have close to about 400 corporations sponsoring COP. You see their banners, their logos everywhere. And then you ask yourself, who are we fighting?
Who are we fighting?
The same guys that are responsible for the problem.
I saw the same thing in Egypt. And I'm like, wow. So exactly what are these people here to do?
Yeah, but we can't give up. And then even COP28 is now in Dubai.
Yeah.
And you know the history of Dubai in their contribution to the oil problem that we are trying to solve. I mean, but then we can't continue to give up. That still appears to be the only global level of conversation around climate change.
Okay.
That's where you have the Secretariat of the UNFCCC make decisions. Even if it is to make noise, we'll go there to make noise. To agitate and advance credible human-phased alternatives, we'll go there. But when it comes to decision coming from COP over the years, and their deliberate attempt, I'll keep saying that, to silence what really matters.
Yes.
You might say it is a failure. I mean, one of our legends, Nimubasi, said the last COP was lost and damaged. I mean, but we can't continue to hope that something good will not come out. And then if we engage government, what exactly are the projects of government? And then what are we taking to COP? So us as civil society, or we as civil society, when we go to COP, we stage protests, we ask for questions that demand immediate answers, and of course future answers, and we lay to the table alternatives that are worth considering. Okay. So we don't just know what the problems are, we know what the solutions are. And then we tell government, come on guys, adopt this solution. They are the solutions that should address infractions in Africa and the global south. Okay,
we can't wind down this conversation without, of course, zeroing in on CAPA. What are the frontline projects that your organization is involved in, particularly in Nigeria at the moment?
Oh, in Nigeria. Do I have to limit it to climate change?
Yes, please.
Okay, great.
That's what we're talking about today. Yeah. But if there are others that are worth mentioning, please go ahead.
Okay, I'll do that. But let me start with climate change. So right now we are carrying out a project called environmental accountability. Okay. And that was why we zeroed our attention to Ayetoro community. Ayetoro community is a community that is sinking. No doubt about that. 85% of the land, gone. 75% of the properties in buildings, gone. So we are asking questions. We are engaging the locals to tell us what Ayetoro was at inception, what Ayetoro is now, and what does the future look like for Ayetoro. To be able to demand, and of course, have Ayetoro enlisted among the community that is unarguably, depend on loss and damage, or that should depend on loss and damage. And Ayetoro is just one of the many communities, And also in Nigeria, like you did mention, we're also trying to see how we can hold corporations responsible. The other day we were in Ibejuleki to see how the Dangote refinery is threatening the survival of people whose land have been taken over from them. And of course, we do media amplification of stories that we've gathered, like I am right now talking about our experiences. Yes. We leverage the print and of course the electronic media to be able to tell the story, and we try to facilitate the needed dialogue between government and the people. Having established over the years that there's a widening disconnection between policies and people. It appears we pass government on the strength of policies made and not on the impact of those policies. So we are somewhere in between, trying to look at how policies of government, when it comes to the Climate Change Act and other policies, just energy transition, affect the people at the front line. Government can be in AC like this, sit in the confines or the comfort of their home, and design policies
for people in Ayetoro.
And then for people in Ayetoro, and for the approval or the appeal of the globe. Yeah, we've seen this very clearly too. Our policies are hurriedly prepared as conditions, maybe for grants coming from World Bank, and not for the interest of those whose policies are to be originally made. So we are somewhere in between, leveraging the media, telling the stories, and facilitating the dialogue between the people and, of course, the government. That's on climate. And, of course, the water justice program to FOCAPA. We believe that water shouldn't be privatized. Water should be a fundamental human right. Everybody should have access, not just to water alone, but to clean, clear, and water of good quality. So any attempt to privatize or to commodify water, I mean, would never sit well with CAPA. We frown very well at this position of government, and of course we think that government needs to, Lagos for instance, where we operate mainly from, is surrounded by water everywhere, but none to drink, considering the quality.
Water everywhere, but none
to drink. So these are just a few. Tobacco control, part of what we do. I mean, SSB, part of what we do. Soft justice, quite a number of our projects. Everywhere.
We're heading towards the budget design cycle for this new administration. Is CAPA having any engagement with government, especially with respect to what you've just mentioned, to prevent that trend where people in National Assembly or people in Aso Villa or in their ministries just sit and think for people in Ayetoro, just put pen to paper based on what they know can be approved, not based on what the people truly need? Is CAPA engaging government, especially at the state level, so that our budgeting cycle can begin to really be designed to address real issues for the real people?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. Yes, we do, and we'll continue to do. Even yesterday, the communique that I issued from our conference here in Abuja was suggested very strongly why letters should be sent to appropriate government quarters, conveying the concerns, shared concerns, not imagined concerns, concerns shared by the front lines, to find its way or their way into the budgetary provisions of government. So when you see us hold events and have engagement with frontline community, it's not just for the sake of those engagements. It's to have clear-cut agenda that will now amplify further and engage government with to accommodate them in the budgetary provision of government. It appears that we all depend on government, unfortunately. And whatever it is that we found out not to be entirely correct at the local level, have a way of us escalating them to the appropriate quarters. I mean, the woman that came from NCC yesterday, National Council on Climate Change, suggested strongly that the communique that came out from our engagement yesterday should be channeled to the CEO of our council. And why? Because she said that would only inform what will get into the council's budget, ahead of the next year budgetary season.
I have to say sincere thank you very much for your time on this segment of the program. We've been discussing climate justice, loss and damage fund, and the gendered perspective. We've been talking for a while now with Ogunlade Olamide Martins. He is the Program Manager, Corporate Accountability and Public Participation Africa, CAPA. Thank you once again for being our guest this morning.
Thank you for having me. It's a complete privilege.